The Dark Room, exploring the strange and controversial, with your hosts, Paul Salvatore and Jordan Randall. Today we're speaking with addiction expert and drug policy advocate, Stanton Peele. So Stan, before we get into your approach towards addiction, I was wondering if you could tell us first about how you became involved in the field of mental health.
Well, I like to say I'm a natural-born psychologist. It's just psychology and addiction are what I've always thought about. Let me just tell you 3 little stories.
Sure.
I like riding on the subways. I like looking at people. I like how they talk to each other, even when I can't hear them.
Okay.
I like to see what mannerisms they display. And I've just lately been reflecting on the fact that, I don't know if I'm unique that way, but it's something that I've always studied, people and their interactions. I've always been curious about their personalities and their lives. So I've always asked people, the second story is I always ask people, I talk to people in the streets of New York. Whenever I have a chance, whenever it's not too, sometimes I actually am riding my bike and I'll stop somebody and talk to them. And generally, they see my genuine curiosity about knowing about them. So let's dial this all the way back for my third story. I grew up in a place called South Philly. I live in Brooklyn now.
Okay.
And there was a man who came home drunk early in the morning, and I would just be, even when I was 5 years old, I would be fascinated by it. I'd pepper my mother with questions. I'd try and understand his experience, which is how I differ from virtually everybody in addiction. People in addiction look for external forces that cause addiction. They say, well, he has a gene or alcohol affects him that way. I don't think that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think, why is this man in this situation? How is he feeling? Why has he placed himself in this situation? What does it accomplish for him? So I've always wanted to be internal in people's worlds, and I think that makes you a psychologist, and in my case, it made me an addiction expert.
Right. And I know one of the things regarding your disagreements with some of the models out there is with AA. And I want to ask you, Stan, how would you describe that contention with AA or Alcoholics Anonymous for people who don't know?
Well, in line with what I just described, I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous views alcoholism as a mysterious affliction. I don't. I view alcoholism as somehow a part of a person's personality and life space.
Right.
So I don't look at it from the outside in, which they do even when they talk about it being a disease, even though it's inside the person, it's an external force. I look at it as part and parcel of the person's world. And at the same time, of course, I reject the can't and the mythology of AA. It's not good to tell people they're powerless. It's not true that most people die of their alcoholism. A larger percentage of people outgrow their alcoholism, even though many continue to drink. Everything AA says is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And, people will say, well, Stanton, how can you be against AA? It's helped so many people. In general, if you tell people things that are wrong, it's bad, and it'll hurt more people than it helps, which I believe is true in the case of AA.
Right.
So Stan, why do you think that the AA would be perpetuating these things if they're wrong? Do you think it's just because they're misinformed, or is there some sort of ulterior motive?
No, I don't think it's a conspiracy. Although obviously individuals make money out of the whole operation, of course, the Betty Ford Center and others. But it grows out of America. It grows out of Americana. America's not doing well with substances. Perhaps you've noticed.
Mm-hmm.
We have record levels of drug-related deaths with heroin, synthetic narcotics, and tranquilizers all at the same time. There's a national survey called NESARC, and it found a 50% increase in certifiable, diagnosable alcohol use disorders between 2001 and 2013. So we've never done that well with drugs and alcohol, but we're proud of it. It's sort of like AA says, well, look how bad we drink. Look how many alcoholics there are. Look how many people are being hurt by drugs. And we say, let's do more of what we've been doing. Let's tell people more that they're suffering from a disease, which is an idea that grows out of America's view of substances. It's not the temperance view. It's not something, for example, that's native in Southern Europe, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And, of course, we're always trying to persuade them to think like we do. We're so damn proud of ourselves that we hope that we can get them to become alcoholics like us, and then we'll have accomplished our great mission.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea, some people don't care that people die. For example, the United States is the last country among Western nations to have adopted needle exchange. Hundreds of thousands of people died due to that reticence. And where did it come from? It came from AA and our crazy abstinence models. Like, well, if people don't quit, doesn't matter what we do, they're going to die anyhow. And so we killed people. Mm-hmm. And nobody cares, really. People will say, well, okay, a few people died of AIDS, but what the hell? We're still advocating for abstinence. Aren't we great?
Right. So, I mean, Stan, whether we're talking about AA or, I mean, if we look at the current landscape of drug rehabilitation in at least North American society, how much do you believe it's informed by sort of a conservative morality or even religion?
Well, AA does have a strong religious component, and of course, Alcoholics Anonymous, they keep claiming they're not moralistic, but they are moralistic.
Okay.
They turn to God. They feel that an addiction is like an affliction. And, you know, this kind of passivity has really afflicted America. Like, we think the drug epidemic has befallen us. You know, right. Donald Trump represents that by saying, well, look, they're coming over our borders. It's this external fear. But really, we're getting some insight into it. Everybody's aware that the highest levels of drug mishaps, suicide, and alcoholism are they've always been predominant, they've always been prevalent in inner city communities, but now they're afflicting white populations who have been at the bottom of the social ladder, people who formerly had a good working class life and a community and a family, now find it's impossible to continue that way. And they become demoralized. So at the same time that we're broadcasting the idea, let's turn to drugs rather than alcohol, that we have an epidemic caused by an influx of cheap synthetic narcotics, fentanyl, alcohol. Well, alcohol is alcohol. It doesn't get cheaper. People are being caused to reflect, in part due to Trump's selection, on what's going on in these pockets of America where people are just forlorn and dejected. Why is that happening? For those people who listen to that radio show, what's it called? It's that podcast where they track a case, and they followed the life of a man. He committed suicide.
Okay.
But he lived in a part of Alabama, a rural part of Alabama, where the people he hung around with are people who didn't give a damn about life in many ways. There wasn't that much for them to live for. And it's kind of insight or being launched into that part of the world or America that most of us just have no appreciation of.
Right. So what we could be looking at really is there's a problem in the culture. There's a cultural crisis or a spiritual crisis, not a moral failing.
Well, it's a problem of people who are in a position where addiction and drugs and alcohol, in a way, makes sense to them.
Right.
And what causes that? What causes that are social and psychological forces. So, you know, getting into the moralism of it is useless. Right. I think I've always had the quality that when people tell me something, you know, as a therapist or as an individual, while I have a strong sense of what's right and what's wrong, like murdering people for using drugs is wrong, I still am able to say, just tell me your story. I'm not going to judge you. You know, you've been hurting yourself more than you've been hurting anybody. Just relax and tell me what's going on, and I'll just listen, and we'll see if we can sort this out to make you, put you in a better place that you'd like to be.
Right. Now, I mean, that certainly sounds like it ties in. Perhaps you can shed some light on it, on the laws, the harsh laws, not only against drug traffickers, but users. And they tend to be very harsh, whether we're looking at American society or Canadian society. Does that tie in with the whole attitude of Americana or the conservative?
Well, I mean, when we talk about my advanced ideas about life, everybody knows, even Republicans now know, that punishing drug users, what sense does that make? Where, I mean, no matter where you're coming from, I mean, we're reaching some kind of a critical mass in America where, I don't know if Donald Trump knows anything, but even he sort of gives lip, although he just, I don't know if you saw, they picked a new drug czar today, and he's some Politico who has no view of drugs. So, I mean, I guess the most accurate thing to say about Donald Trump is he doesn't give a shit and he doesn't know anything. It's like he doesn't know anything about anything. But there are many Republicans, well, and one of them doesn't happen to be our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who's one of the few Republican holdouts against, you know, reducing the prison population. But there's quite a strong element in the Republican Party, certainly in the Democratic Party, to just say, we're not making any headway for anybody who's using drugs personally by punishing them. Aren't they being punished enough? How admirable are their lives? And from my point of view, the way it works is people proceed to emerge from dark areas of their lives, and when they're able to do that, they're able to reduce or decline drugs or over alcohol drinking or other obsessive destructive behaviors. How does arresting them help them do that? If anything, you know, it detracts from their ability to have a family, to have an education, to have a job. Everything should be geared towards connecting them to life, not deconnecting them from life.
Yes. I mean, there seems also to be a kind of labeling that goes on within some of or a lot of the models still that are existing of addiction. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us why, Stan, that, you know, there's this view still that once an addict, always an addict. Even when someone's recovering, right, you hear them talking about themselves as an addict or as a recovering addict. It's never someone who's overcome their addiction, or at least we still hear that. And what do you think is behind that?
Well, of course, that starts with Alcoholics Anonymous. One of its worst sins is making you declare I'm an alcoholic. First of all, they make you declare that, and you don't know that when you first start out. We don't know where you're at, you know, what kind of drinking problem you have. Second of all, they make that your identity. Who does that?
Right.
You don't go and treat people who, you know, have a learning disability and say, oh, you're retarded. We don't do that. Tell everybody you're a retard. Nobody does that.
Right.
But AA hangs on to that labeling, self-labeling, which is the worst.
Right.
I mean, it's bad enough for somebody else to call you an addict or an alcoholic, and you're allowed to do that in AA. You're allowed to say, oh, look, he's an alcoholic, but he's in denial.
Right.
That's illegal, immoral, and in any other area we would recognize it's completely non-therapeutic. But in addiction, we still hang on to saying, oh, making people aware that they're addicts, getting them to admit it, that's the number one thing we should do. It's the absolutely opposite of what we should do. First of all, we need to recognize that most people outgrow addiction.
Right.
All the data tell us that. I won't bore you with study after study showing that. But, of course, especially young people outgrow the kind of excessive behavior that you could witness on a college campus. It's the normal progression in life. And the thing that makes it most likely that they won't outgrow it is if they're launched into some kind of a recovery dormitory, or whether if they're given an identity at 17 or 18 or 19, which is a sin against mankind, to declare that they're an addict or an alcoholic for the rest of their lives.
Right.
I mean, it just defies human sensibility to believe that somebody thinks that's a positive thing to do to a child.
Absolutely. I mean, in your view, Stan, is it, I mean, we hear different debates all the time, including the one we're talking about now. Addiction is a moral failing or addiction is a disease. Do you think that it's neither of these things, or do you think it is a disease, or how do you view it?
Well, that's what they call, I think, a Hobbesian choice. It's giving you two false alternatives and say, pick one.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Addiction is a way of relating to the world.
Okay.
You found something that you feel enables you to deal with your life, your feelings, and the outside world, and you're relying on it. You may get stuck in it for a time. It's useless to think about as a moral failing, although turning to people's values is helpful sometimes in getting them out of it without saying, well, you're bad.
Right.
You say to them, well, what's important to you? What do you care about? And they'll say, being alive, my family, being a good person, achieving something. They'll have their own values, and then you'll try and relate their behavior to those things,
right,
and see whether that can be one of the motivations to get people to move ahead.
Sure.
As we've already discussed out tonight, I'm telling them they have a disease is useless. So just saying it's a way that people have learned to come accommodate to life
Right.
is really a strong is an alternative. I have a treatment program online called the Life Process Program,
Right.
and that I think that gives a sense of how people's lives and their engagement in their lives, the way they relate to the world, is what's at the source of addiction and what's the way out of addiction.
So, so David, I'm wondering, you mentioned that your, interest in all of this stems from your sort of natural observer side of your own personality. I'm wondering, though, do you also share any personal experiences of addiction that have helped you gain some perspective on this whole thing?
Well, I mean, one of the things I say about addiction is that, I said it, my first book's Love and Addiction, 1975. My most recent book is called Recover, Stop Thinking Like an Addict, in 2015. I've been doing this a while. But one thing I say is we all understand the dynamics of addiction. All of us have some weak area in our lives where we struggle to get control of it, where we feel, oh my God, here it's going again. I'll never be able to deal with this. So I'm actually writing my memoir right this second. I've just, completed the first draft.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have one chapter called My Love and Sex Addiction.
Okay.
So I'll have to wait. Your readers will have to wait for that to appear. But let's just say I wrote a book in 1975 called Love and Addiction when I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I thought I was fooling anybody, but whenever I talk to anybody who's read the book or knows me, they say, well, obviously, Stanton, you were gaining insight from your own life experience.
Mm-hmm.
What else would you say it was that you were thinking about? So that was my first presentation of an experiential model of addiction. And, it grew from inside of me.
Interesting. Okay, so I also wanted to get your take on, obviously, there's a lot of new legalization of marijuana and these dispensaries in California. We're having similar things happening here in Toronto. Now, I'm wondering, do you think that sort of movements like this are positive or negative for the potential of people developing addictions, primarily youth?
Well, I have some moderately radical and very radical views on that. I mean, making marijuana illegal is just stupid. It was a stupid thing in the first place. It's stupid now. And the data in from Colorado is that neither youth problem use nor adult problem use is decreased by making it legal. The logic might be that once you bring something out into the open and you're, clear about what the rules are, that you enable people to use the substance in a more constructive way. Societies like Italy and Greece, where alcohol is an accepted part of life, it's not a forbidden fruit, do much better with alcohol. But we need to get beyond that. You may be aware, in North America, there is one open injection site where people can come and inject whatever drug they use under medical supervision. And there's one heroin maintenance site where people are provided with pharmaceutically pure heroin. The first place I described is Insight, INSITE. It's in Vancouver. I spoke to their staff. The other place is also in Vancouver. But there's in the United States, we're having astronomical levels of drug deaths. And, no matter what we do, I mean, the states that are the most advanced and bragging about what they're doing, Vermont, for example, their death rates are still going up. They can't get a handle of it. And yet we actually know the cure for dying from narcotics use. We know what the answer is. Nobody has ever died, so far as I'm aware, at a supervised injection site or a heroin maintenance site. And that's because, they're doing it under medical supervision, but it's primarily because they're getting pure drugs. At an injection site, their drugs may be tested. At a maintenance site, the drug is pharmaceutically pure. People don't die from taking too much of a drug. They die from the impurities of the drug, and they die from mixing drugs. Heroin in the United States is now increasingly mixed with fentanyl. It's at 90 in New York. The medical examiner's office says that 94% of drug-related deaths are drug mixture deaths. So we need to, and my whole view of addiction has always been from the start that drug addiction and alcoholism are one part of the panoply of kinds of addictions that people form. It shouldn't be dealt with. I mean, we have rules about where and when and how you can drink alcohol. You need rules for a lot of things. But these same types of sensible regulations should be applied to every single drug. I mean, we're not going to let people distribute heroin in the streets, although in the 19th century America, you could buy opiates on any corner, in any drugstore. Laudanum was given to babies, but we won't go into that. We've developed at the same time this incredible fear of these drugs, and at the same time, we're having the worst possible results with them, with these incredible addiction and death rates. And those two things go together. We need to demilitarize our approach to drugs. We need to, I'll throw out a phrase here, we need to normalize drug use. We need to make it a part of normal human experience, learn how to do it, safeguard against the worst negative outcomes, starting with dying from it, and get on with and that's where the world's heading, because we can't control the proliferation of new types of narcotics and other drugs. It can't be done. They're being invented as we speak. So we need to have some accommodation with the fact that the world is rife with addictive opportunities by creating people and systems that allow people to be exposed to these things without being sucked into them.
Right. Now, Stan, I know that it's becoming something that people are becoming more aware of, this idea of harm reduction and safe injection sites and things like that. Perhaps you can maybe describe what that is in essence, and why we as a society, or not all of us, but it's still such a divisive issue when the data is there to show that it is helping people.
What I've been speaking, I think, pretty clearly from what I think it correctly identify as a harm reduction perspective.
Right.
Heroin maintenance is one example. Needle exchange and the failure to do it in the United States is another example. Learning to drink in a socially responsible way is another example. A harm reduction is a point of view that it's not drugs that are the problem. I mean, I know Ethan Nadelman, he's an old friend of mine, who's the head of retiring as head of the DPA, would say, often the policies are the bigger problem. That's not how I would put it exactly. I would say drugs are not the problem. People's life situations and their attitudes towards drugs are the problem.
Right.
Drugs have been around forever. They'll always be around. The idea, the goal of eliminating drugs is ridiculous. And so we need to accommodate to them and to eliminate or moderate, minimize, reduce the harms associated with them. And I would go even farther and say, well, we might even try and think about what's the best use for some drugs. For example, most people, even in the United States, as temperance-oriented as we are, enjoy alcohol in a positive way. They have a glass of wine at dinner, or they have a drink or two at a wedding, or they toast a baby being born with champagne. People understand that alcohol has a place in the world, a place in their lives, to be used in a responsible, community-based, mentally healthy way. And believe it or not, that's true of every drug known to man. For example, I mean, we have uses for narcotics. We use them to kill pain. You get real narcotics in the hospital, and 99% of people are god-awful glad for it. And the concept is, well, you use a pain reliever when you have pain. That's the concept.
Right.
You don't use it as a lifestyle. So harm reduction means accommodating the fact that people use drugs, reducing as much as possible the dangers they encounter from that. And I would say going even further, thinking about what positive possibilities there are around substance use. And I'm pretty sure you're aware, many people have come up with positive ways of using marijuana. So, most people are aware of that concept. That it can be fun, it can be sexually stimulating, it can be interesting even, provoke discussions.
Right.
But, the dangers and the pitfalls, the positive benefits can be listed for every single substance known to man. I mean, fentanyl is a medically used drug.
Right.
And the idea is to balance that out and to relate to drugs for the positive options that they offer us.
Right. Yes. And Stan, I know that in the U.S. as well as in Canada, much of the approach to addiction still is abstinence-based. So I can imagine that you're coming up against a fair amount, to say the least, of opposition. So I'm just wondering what kinds of challenges you've experienced within the mental health community in terms of improving the outlook and policies regarding addiction treatment.
Well, it's a mixed picture. You're right. There's a tremendous amount of resistance, but just, marijuana is legal in the United States now.
Right.
You also have to realize that 20 and 30 years ago, you could practically be shot for saying AA and abstinence aren't the answer. Let's just say that now it's not the prevalent point of view, but it's much more widely accepted. A lot of people understand the concept now. A lot more people understand the concept that, some people are going to use drugs and alcohol even after they've been declared or even after they themselves feel that they're addicted. And yet we need to accommodate to that. Research, as I said, has shown that a majority of people who've ever been alcohol dependent actually continue to drink and lose the dependence. So as prevalent as AA and abstinence models are, the President of the United States claims never to have had a drink of alcohol, and he has 3 children who say they've never taken a drug or drunk alcohol. That may turn out to be the worst and craziest thing about that clan of people. But and who knows what mischief they're all going to do. Because Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, drink it all. He comes from Alabama. That's just, Southern states have a strong temperance tradition. But the idea of substance use, which a lot of people recognize with alcohol and drug use as being a normal part of life, is expanding. And although I faced horrible opposition throughout my life, there's this change in the world that's clearly perceptible where these things can at least be discussed.
Right.
For example, there was a front-page article in the New York Times where a 12-step-based treatment center said they're now offering people the option of using marijuana in place of alcohol or, I think, narcotics when they have a problem with the other.
Right.
So that's not your standard AA approach. And these guys are 12-step guys, and they say, well, we know how often the abstinence model fails. We see it all the time. We had to be aware of it. We have to expand and try it on. And the fact that they're doing it is significant, A, and B, the fact that they put that on the front page of the New York Times is significant because it's obviously an idea that's developing some kind of currency.
Sure. Yes. I'm just wondering, in your view, is someone who's experiencing addiction autonomous? Because we often hear from the absence side that once you've become ensnared by the drug, that you've lost the capacity to make executive decisions with the brain and so forth. You cannot choose. How much of that is true in your view?
Well, that's bullshit. We know it's bullshit.
Right.
Everybody knows it's bullshit. They just think about I'll give you a million. Everybody knows it's bullshit.
Right.
For example, when in New York City they passed laws, and then they passed them all over the country, that you can't drink in a bar, people freaked out. They said, well, what'll happen? People won't come to restaurants.
Right.
When people said, well, you can no longer smoke in workplaces, people said, that's impossible. People can't control their smoking.
Right.
When people said, well, I don't let people smoke in my home, they said, well, how can you do that? And everybody got with the program. Everybody got with the program. In fact, bartenders and bar owners said, it's better not to smell the smoke. Right. People go out and they smoke in the lobby, and obviously it's encouraged quite a few people to quit smoking.
Right.
And ironically, this has been a strange statistic. Cigarettes, we know, are among the most addictive substances on earth. The average amount that even people who smoke, the average number of cigarettes that even people who smoke, has declined steadily since the Surgeon General's report in 1964.
Yes.
So people are still smoking. We still say they're addicted.
Right.
But even so, they're smoking less. And I mean, one obvious reason is, well, there's a lot fewer places you can smoke.
Right.
So, people have had to cut back on that. Sure. Now, of course, we haven't mentioned any individual names, any villains, but here's one. Nora Volkow is at the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Mm-hmm. She pushes the chronic brain disease model where, your brain is captured. It's ridiculous. Right. It's been disproved by every type of research available, but that's not what's most worst about it. It's dysfunctional.
Right.
It prevents people from finding their own best routes where they will get some kind of control over it, more or less. And that's what harm reduction is about. Mm-hmm. At least if you're having a clean needle, you're having some control over your habit, which is less harmful for you. Right. And my new book called Recover, Stop Being Like an Addict is about allowing people to meditate on the fact that they do have some control over their drug use, even at periods when it kind of looks like they don't. They're always exerting some kind of control, mm-hmm. and to expand that part of we could use the analogy, that part of your brain, but it's just not that simple. Right. You don't look in the brain and see where the control button is. It can expand that degree of control in your life and over the substance.
Right. So
that concludes our discussion with Stanton Peele. Mm-hmm. I think that That was a very fascinating conversation. I think that Stanton is really onto some stuff. I think that while I can't completely agree with some of the things that he mentioned, I think that it is a very interesting realm, the realm of addiction. It's I mean, we've spoken to some other characters in that realm, and I think that what seems to be unanimous about all of those people is that addiction does come from an individualistic place. So it's not a constant, and it differs from person to person. However, we do tend to see that people that have addictive personalities are the sort of people that may find themselves getting roped into the downward spiral. But that being said, we've never heard anybody necessarily talk about rehabilitation being a sort of negative combat to addiction, which is fascinating because I actually sat in on a AA meeting about 2 years ago.
Okay.
It took place at a church that was down on, I think, Queen Street or King Street.
Okay.
It's like there's like a hospital there.
Right.
I forget the name of it, but I went there and I was curious as to what went on there. And what I noticed was a really interesting diversity in people, because there were some people there that were speaking, and they had been sober for like X amount of years, like some as many as 10, 15 years.
Right.
And they're telling their stories, and they seem reborn, almost in a kind of corny sense, like almost like a sort of like almost like a religious, like born again thing, where it's like they're telling you stories about how horrible they used to be as people, and like they would drink all the time and they'd steal money from people that they claimed to love.
Right.
And then now they are like one step removed from like Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, where they're like wearing their shirts tucked into their pants, but their pants like up by their like chest.
Right.
And there's those people, but then there's also like a guy sitting towards the back near where I was, who's like pulling his flask out of his coat pocket every 5 seconds and taking a sip. And I was like, this guy's at an AA meeting and he's getting drunk, and it's obvious he reeks of booze. And then there's like other people that are, that are saying, oh, I've been sober for 6 weeks or whatever. Some people 3 weeks. And yeah, that last year I was sober for a month, but then I relapsed. And so there's all these varying degrees, which to me, even at that moment, made me think, this doesn't work. Like, I mean, it doesn't not work, but it also definitely is not 100% bound to completely cure the disease of alcoholism, because clearly, okay, that one guy like got out of it and he's 15 years away from it, but then all these other people are still relapsing, and then this one dude is just straight up just drinking in the back. So clearly it doesn't work. Clearly there are problems there. Now, if those problems are exactly what Stanton is suggesting they are,
Right.
I'm not entirely sure, but I mean, it's definitely a possibility.
Absolutely. I'm in agreement with Stan, and I feel because, I know because I think the term addict carries such a stigma, and so perhaps within the setting of AA, to confess that you're an addict is a safe space, and so you're not going to be met with negativity, and so have to feel defensive and so forth. But once you step into the culture and you think of yourself as an addict, you refer to yourself as an addict, there's a lot of shame, I think, that someone's going to experience as a result of that. And we know that, I mean, there's studies, infinite amount of studies showing that shame never works as a good corrector, or as a good teacher, whatever you want to call it. And so we have to really come to a more enlightened understanding, I feel, about, and I think Stan is there. I really feel that he hit the nail on the head when he talked about how it's sort of a maladaptive response to a life situation. It's where someone is now, not forever. But a lot of the addiction models out there are so antiquated that it's still that idea that we kind of talked about in the cast, once an addict, always an addict.
Right.
Even people who, I remember one of the times that I first kind of was reckoning with this was in Ottawa. I met a counselor, a friend, who kept on referring to herself as a recovering addict, and I didn't know what that meant. Does that mean like you use sometimes, or
you're totally done,
you're
it's all
mostly
past,
done,
yeah.
or like you're like, and no, she's totally clean, right? But that's how she viewed her. That was the identity she had come to accept about herself through. I wasn't sure if it was, I can't remember now if it was AA or anything, but based on whatever model she was subscribing to, she would now see her, or at that time would see herself for the rest of her life as a recovering addict. And I remember even too once, cannot mention it, but where I was doing some work with clients, there was a big debate between some of the staff. It was just an impromptu debate between some of the staff, some of the clients. There was one new client who thought that, once I have rehabilitated, I'm no longer addict. Like I am an addict now. I have a substance abuse issue right now, but later I won't be, so I'll be okay to like revisit the spots that I used to use and things like that, because I'll be in charge of myself. I'll have regained enough autonomy so that these triggers won't, compel me to act on my impulse. And everyone was really upset in that room. Everyone had really subscribed to this sort of 12-step thinking that you can't do that. You're powerless over your addiction. You will always be. Right. Submit to God. That was the thing, right? God. You got to submit to God, to the higher power, or else you're doomed. It's very cultish. Yeah. We have to really start thinking, I think, in terms of harm reduction. I know there's a lot of efforts here in Toronto to get that underway with safe injection. We have to come to grips with, what is the reality? People do use drugs, and we care about people. We want to be compassionate, so we want to make sure that the spaces are safe. They're equipped with the right personnel to ensure, not to encourage, hard substance use, but to ensure that if people are going to do it, that they're not going to die. Yeah. And we still, I think, are at a point in the culture in general. There's a division between, what science tells us, what the medical community, the progressive one, thinks, and what the culture still sees as a moral failing. So bridging those two things together, I think that is getting underway, thankfully, in places like Toronto. It's unfortunate there has to be a crisis, like in this case, the opiate crisis, to get that ball rolling before other places in the world, or places in the world start doing that.
Sure.
But I think, we talked about those three things: moral failing, disease model addiction, and also this life maladjustment. Some people are even talking about it as verbatim using this phrase as a learning disorder. So, but it's within that realm. I think it's something that's sort of phasic. It's kind of something that's relative to someone's situation at the time. Most people do recover in a way that's healthy, as Stanton was saying. But why isn't that being talked about? I mean, it reminds me of, why we punish offenders more than we rehabilitate them. Like we have maybe a sense of safety as a society, false sense of safety, if we're able to kind of, label people, throw away the key, and just be, comfortable in our thinking that that's the best way for us all to treat wrongdoers, right? But we know that if that's all you do, societies that just punish, recidivism rates are so high.
Yeah, it's true, and I like what Stan mentioned about it, like addiction being something that could be outgrown.
Right, exactly.
Because I think that really is something. I mean, of course, there's exceptions to the rule with anything, but I think that definitely holds true to a large extent, because I've mentioned this for a long time, because I grew up in Spain,
right?
And in Spain, while at that time at least, while they still had laws about legal ages for certain substances, cigarettes and alcohol,
right?
They didn't really enforce them, and so I remember when I was growing up there, it wouldn't be uncommon whatsoever to see like a 13-year-old kid walking down the street, smoking a cigarette, and holding like a half-finished bottle of like red wine in one hand, and just doing that with impunity. And I remember even going out to the bars, because I actually didn't even drink when I was in high school, but I still wanted to be social, so I went, hung out with my friends, and you'd see these young kids basically solely like populating the bars. Like they just didn't really care. But at the same time, that kind of is what Stanton was saying with this European sort of mentality.
Right.
Italians, Spanish people, Spaniards, I suppose is the right word. They kind of get this out of their system at an earlier age, and I think that all plays into the outgrowing addiction thing. Because I've always thought that it's so ridiculous to have a legal drinking age. I mean, here at least it's 19, but in the States at 21, it's like, okay, what happens when you first discover alcohol? Not for everybody, but most people go off the deep end.
Yes.
Because it's such a new experience and it's super fun.
Right.
So you go off the deep end, you go real hard at it until you realize how horrible you feel the day after and these other negative effects that come along with it. And then you slowly start to mellow out, and then you sort of use these substances appropriately when you can. It works its way into your life. So, or works its way out of your life, depending on what your life, demands. So, having a legal age at like 19 and 21, it's always seemed so silly to me because it's like, what happens to an individual in those years, normally speaking?
Right.
That's normally the prime time for post-secondary education in a person's life.
Right.
And that's when you're giving them the license to drink. That seems like the worst time for someone to go off the deep end and completely indulge in alcohol, because then they're just gonna like fuck up their scholastic endeavors. If they got that out of their system, however, when they were like 15 or 16, then probably by the time 19 rolls around or 21, they're not gonna be like, okay, let's go to the bar and do like 300 tequila shots.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's my own apprehension with the absence-based approach is that, it's kind of like, I don't know, I'm just visually like, I was talking here, I'm seeing, in rodeos, the bull before that is let out the gate.
Yeah.
It's like that. It's just once you give the freedom, then it's chaos, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what I see, as bad as like you're kind of withholding this person from any kind of moderation. So the pendulum will swing the other way. It's like we want to avoid extremes. I think that's the whole point of all this, and I think it's a good. I think if someone has an addiction and could come to the point where they're using moderately, I think that's great. If they can use healthily and they're not abusing the substance, that's good. But but the abstinence model is like you've relapsed.
Yeah.
Well, how so? If it can be shown that this person is not being irresponsible, if this person has gone from drinking, 3 or 4 or 6 packs a day and a Mickey of vodka, whatever, to just having a drink or 2 with a meal per day. I mean, how is that a bad thing? I don't know. Yeah.
I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I mean, if that guy's like, every time he has the drink, he becomes like a maniac that beats his children in life, then, okay, no, stop doing that.
Right. So that's what I think the goal is, moderation, because that's... these things have their good qualities too. Alcohol, I mean, they're enjoyable. You won't want to miss our next episode. We're talking with award-winning documentary filmmaker
and self-proclaimed curmudgeon,
Alan Zweig.
Until then,
this is The Dark Room.